There's a chapter, Romans 13, that is used to try to get people to obey anything the state or the government says or does.
But all the holy people of the Lord God
teaches us that there can be favorite groups, that there can be people who are chosen and are special in their Creator's eyes, and that those not in line with certain beliefs can and should be punished or even put to death.
The Bible legitimizes violence. The biblical account is littered with bodies. In the Hebrew Bible, it's the chosen people, the Jews, who are able to do what is necessary in order to safeguard themselves. There are stories in the Hebrew Bible in which God demands the submission of other populations, the wiping out of other populations.
From the Bible, we learn that there are clear distinctions between people. There are righteous and the so-called unrighteous. There are Jews and so-called Gentiles. The Bible is the source that teaches us that there is a hierarchy amongst humans, with a God who sides with certain people he deems as his people. Chosen thee to be a special people, the Lord loved Israel, chosen Jacob unto himself. God went to redeem for a people to himself, separate them from among all the people, and I have chosen the seed of Abraham, are just a few examples.
And I've always argued that the only way you can be a chosen person is not by some God making you a chosen person. The only way you can be a chosen person is to be a self-choosing person. And when Africans are self-choosing, they become chosen people. It's only when you are not self-choosing that you, in a sense, are outside of your own history.
But that's what the Old Testament does. It says, my tribe, I've been given the right by my God to dominate your tribe. Well, in current culture, and in many other cultures, that notion that my tribe is blessed by God allows me to do things to other people who are not like me in the name of my God. And that's all racism is in many cases. The permission, a God-given permission by one group to dominate, oppress, and rule another group.
I think we all read the Bible from our own social, political, economic, cultural location. And so the Bible reads differently depending on who's reading it. So the Bible is a tool. It can be used any way you want to use it. I mean, I've seen people use witches as animals.
In monotheistic belief systems, there has to be an adversary. In fact, the concept of a devil is exclusive to monotheism. Blacks, perceived as the antithesis of whites, were considered heathens, essentially devils, whose very purpose was to be enslaved. The Bible was used to rationalize slavery, and it even provided instructions on how to treat slaves. This put meat to the bones of American enslavement and justified an institution of chattel slavery that lasted nearly 4 centuries.
None of these books are written by God, because there's no such thing. So they're not written by God. They're written by human beings who then claim that God wrote them. You see, they're written by human beings who say, this is the word of God.
Virginia lawmakers and presidents took the Bible's view of slavery literally, as it served to confirm their view of blacks and their reasons for being. In 1667, the Virginia legislature wrote into law the principle that God himself rendered the slaves inferior because God was on the side of the master.
White supremacy in itself as a notion depends upon the idea that the white race is supreme by virtue of God's own blessing.
Now, whiteness is a concept. I mean, it's that, it has changed. I mean, there was a time when Italians were not white, when Jews were not white, when Irish were not white. So when whiteness becomes the concept that can be dispensed like that, then of course if you have that whiteness, you can certainly have privilege in a racist society. All racist societies are constructed along hierarchical lines.
In order to arrive at presumptions regarding superiority and inferiority as it relates to human beings, one must first have the backings or blessings of something. Notions of superiority must be endorsed by something feared, trusted, respected, and perceived as greater than human. The validation, endorsement, and approval of white supremacy came directly from a God fantasy.
The brain gave us something that it needed to explain what we did not know. What was it? Where does lightning come from? Why do people die? How is birth possible? The brain even gives itself its name. The brain is quite tricky in these things, you see. So the creation of God is a human creation.
The belief in a God who made the colonists exclusively in his image solidified and guaranteed perceptions of divine value and worth.
Remember that you are an Englishman and have consequently won first prize in the lottery of life.
South African businessman Cecil Rhodes. Like gold and silver, once gave the dollar its value and was redeemable by law. The founders of America believed that white supremacy was backed and given value by the God in their fantasies, and that they would be redeemed on Judgment Day for the institution of slavery, since it followed the natural order of their God's purpose for humanity.
In all social systems, there must be a class to do the menial duties, to perform the drudgery of life. That is, a class requiring but a low order of intellect and but little skill. Fortunately for the South, she has found a race adapted to that purpose at her hand, a race inferior to her own, but eminently qualified in temper, in vigor, in docility, in capacity to stand the climate, to answer all her purposes. We use them for our purpose, and we call them slaves.
James Henry Hammond, South Carolina Senator.
How is it that a white population has been able to bear the weight of such violent disregard of other folks? Right? How do they sleep at night in light of the violent approach towards black, brown, and other so-called racial minorities? It seems to me that this takes place in a variety of ways. One, they assume that these other populations are not fully human in the way that whites are human. They are not entitled to what whites are entitled to.
When one believes in a supreme being, it's a seamless transition to believe in supreme human beings. But blacks were considered less than human, and blackness was believed to be a sin in Virginia. Therefore, blacks were encouraged to believe that their blackness was a sin in the eyes of a God who is perceived and depicted as white. The goal of the slave codes, which were a series of statutes that became law, were to make blacks feel so hopeless and powerless about being black that they would more easily submit to lifelong servitude.
When you back a group's collective bias with legal authority and institutional control, it's transformed into a far-reaching system that is not dependent on any individual's good intentions, self-image, or friendliness.
The The most efficient way to accomplish such a demoralizing mindset was through Christianity. The enslaved blacks had to come to grips with the notion that it was God himself that made them inferior, and therefore it was to be accepted as just an act of nature. After all, according to the Virginia legislature and all the colonies that followed its leadership, this was God's will, and anyone opposed to this natural order would have to take it up with the big man upstairs. And essentially, that's how gods have been depicted throughout history, as big, exaggerated versions of ourselves that we assign various superhuman traits and attributes that serve our emotional needs and help us reconcile our fears.
And so I think it's really ultimately about power. Whose ideas, whose culture, whose history, whose spirituality, whose notions of deity reign supreme and therefore are normal, and as opposed to or as compared to others. So ultimately, I think it's about power.
Beginning in 1705 until 1865, the slave codes determined the treatment of blacks in a way that no other period had. Things changed dramatically. In 1705, the Virginia General Assembly permanently sealed the fate of blacks.
All servants imported and brought to the country who were not Christians in their native country shall be accounted and be slaves. All Negro, mulatto, and Indian slaves within this dominion shall be held to be real estate. If any slave resist his master, corrected such slave, and shall happen to be killed in such correction, the master shall be free of all punishment, as if such accident never happened.
This just in,
Wow.
St. Louis, a judge there has found a former police officer not guilty of first-degree murder in the 2011 shooting death of a black motorist.
The U.S. Department of Justice will not bring charges against Baltimore police officers in connection with the death.
He shot into a car with no regard to human life, and that's okay.
That insufficient evidence exists to charge either officer with a federal crime.
After the grand jury in Staten Island chose not to indict a police officer in the
This 1705 Virginia law, another law that was followed by the rest of the colonies, was the Category 5 hurricane that flooded the mentalities of the nation with the idea that blacks are indeed less in kind, in a legal sense, and in the eyes of their God. Again, the first step in so-called civilizing enslaved blacks was to force them to accept Christianity. Given the times when believing in gods were the norm, it's reasonable to assume that many blacks actually believed that the master's God was indeed a superior God, since it was clear that they were the ones enslaved. The master made certain that there was little distinction between serving his God and serving him. It was necessary for the slave master that the enslaved blacks perceived he and God as one and the same. Virginia legislatures did their best to clear all doubts of greater and lesser as far as humans were concerned. For nearly 2 centuries, there was no real distinction between sheep, horses, cattle, and blacks.